Today I'm here with Dr. Klint Kendrick. Dr. Klint Kendrick has been in the world of M&A for more than 10 years, starting as an acquired employee, a catching manager, and then an HR leader on nearly 100 M&A transactions for multiple Fortune 500 companies. Many of his transactions have involved founder-led firms where he helped onboard their CEOs and their teams into much larger organizations. Klint is also the chair of the HR Mergers and Acquisitions Roundtable and author of 2 books for HR practitioners working in the M&A space, one on due diligence and the other on cultural integration. Where I always like to start is kind of give us your background. How did you get into the mergers and acquisition space? What drew you here, and who are you and what you stand for, kind of thing.
Sure. So my first experience with M&A was quite a while back. I was an acquired employee, like you mentioned. I was working as a recruiter at the time, and the company that I was with had been part of a roll-up strategy by a firm that then wanted to sell to one of the big boys out there. The first time, nothing really changed, Ron. I got a new email address, right? Second time, they changed my compensation so much that I ended up leaving. I had a brand new baby at home. I, had a 2-year-old, and it just ended up changing things so much that I was worried about how I was going to pay my rent and buy groceries. So coming from that place where I had a really rough experience with M&A, as I continued through my career, I really kept that with me and kept in mind that we got to take care of people when we're doing M&A work. So I became a catching manager when a company I was with did an acquisition, and also not a great experience. Nobody let me know, hey, you're going to end up with a couple of new team members because we've just done this buy. In fact, I found out about the acquisition when one of the people at that company called me and said, hey, I think you're my new boss. And I'm like, I don't think so. They would have told me. Well, 3 weeks later, I was his new boss. Really, really not well handled. So fast forward about 10 years after that, which is about 10 years ago, and I was with a big company in the aerospace and defense space, and was offered the opportunity to do some work in M&A as an HR leader, and taking those lessons with me and really trying to understand how we work with people, how important people are in these transactions, and then learning from a company that actually did the people side of things very, very well has just given me a profound opportunity to share that knowledge with others. I've since moved on. I'm now with my 4th company doing M&A work, leading an M&A practice, and just really, really passionate about making sure that the people, the leadership, and the culture issues are attended to so that we don't end up with people like me going, oh my gosh, how am I going to pay my rent, right? How am I going to take care of my kids?
What do we do with the people?
Sure.
And I want to work with you. What kind of? Let's just start from, I guess, the beginning. You're going through a deal. There's some. Is there due diligence? I think I was reading one of your books that actually talks about due diligence. Is there due diligence you do on this staff?
It depends on the deal, but so often so all of my experience, Ron, has been with Fortune 500s, except for a couple of joint ventures that I did when I was working for a China-based company. So setting those JVs aside, because the cultural context for M&A in China is just so very different than it is in the US. So setting those aside, when we think about M&A in the US and Europe, where we do a lot of this, typically the brokers and the folks that work on the diligence side, they're primarily concerned with the financials. And I completely understand that, right? When a company chooses to purchase, they're making a decision on how they spend their money, right? You can dump it into R&D, you can do a new marketing campaign, you can do people's salaries, you can go buy a company, right? We got lots of choices on how we spend this money, and it comes down to the money. But you want to make sure that money's well spent. And I think we've all seen the stats that 70 to 90% of all M&As fail to deliver deal value. That's not me, that's Harvard. 70% of all deals destroy value, destroy shareholder value. And again, that's not me, that's Harvard. And the diligence on staff is usually limited to whether or not the buying business sponsor or the corp dev team or the broker likes the founder, right? That's the diligence process. Do I like you? Do I think we get along? And sure, that's fair. It's an approach. We got to make sure that we like the people that we work with. But it's not a particularly thorough process, and it's not always the most thoughtful process. So what I've tried to do with my book on due diligence is talk about not just those leaders, but there's also a cultural component. There's a compliance component. And then there's how people affect the actual operations of the business.
But actually a communication plan on how you're going to communicate with the employees and align them with any shifts in that culture, that vision, and their current set of goals and objectives.
Yeah.
I think if you handled both, like if you handled like here's the way it's always been, here's the kind of things we're going to change, like here's the similarities, and here's like where it's going to be different, right? And I haven't been in your seat, but tell me if I'm wrong. If that stuff's in place, it can lessen the blow of what's going on.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right that you want to make sure that you understand where the culture clash is going to come up, right? And the way that I think we have to look at this is that we can't pay attention to everything. There's just only so much time and so much capacity for us to really focus on issues. So, we've done a little bit of research into what the key drivers of culture clash are in most of the deals that are out there. So I want to be real specific for a second. So one of I don't know if it's an issue, it's just a little bit of my perspective, is a lot of when we talk about culture clash in M&A, you end up with these stories about like Daimler-Benz and Chrysler, these mega mergers that involve billions of dollars, thousands of employees. But the bread and butter deal out there is a company with fewer than 100 employees being picked up by a firm that's a little bit bigger. So we're not, able to really scale those lessons from, Daimler, Chrysler, or from, any of these other big mergers that really make the headlines. But because that's not what we do most of the time. So when we dial back from those really big deals and look at what's out there, where most of the conflict comes up is around decision making. Who gets to make decisions. But there are three big deal pieces that I think you got to consider. And one of those is synergies. So if you've got a deal that's based on some kind of synergy realization and you've not tested whether or not you can put that synergy into place effectively, then there's a bit of an issue. And a lot of times in the HR side, those synergies are usually around pulling systems out, putting systems in, consolidating locations. And that can cause a big problem with the employees and how they perform and how they produce. Those pieces of secret sauce, those are really important things. We hear about that a lot in deal making is, what's the secret sauce of that company? Well, usually it's a technology piece and the things that I've done, or they've got some sort of process or proprietary IP. And you can destroy that when you force a company to change the way that they do business. So you can really, burn the secret sauce as it is. And then finally, those sacred cows, those tend to be a little bit softer. But, there's tales abound out there about, U.S. companies that'll go buy a firm in, England, and they'll disconnect the tea service, right? And so employees will be up in arms because, the tea service isn't happening. Or I have a friend whose company was bought here in the U.S. One of the big perks was snacks, right? So you have developers, and those developers are working, 12-hour days to get something out the door, and they see the snacks as kind of fair trade. You're going to feed me, I'm going to work extra hours. And you take that away because you're cost cutting, and all of a sudden those employees, kind of like your folks that took the servers, feel betrayed. They feel upset, and they're like, fine, you're paying me for 8, I'll work for 8. And all of a sudden you've got increased staffing costs, you got people quitting, you have people who are stonewalling and being less productive just because you touched one of those sacred cows and did it to save a couple $1,000s. Well, it cost you a lot more than that because you just messed with the way that organization works.
What type of questions do we ask? What do we look for?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of ways to gather cultural intelligence. And, I use that term interchangeably with cultural due diligence, but it's really learning about the company that you're about to do a deal with, whether you're on the buy side or on the sell side, to make sure there's a level of compatibility. So there's a few things. One, when you're in your pre-LOI stage, right, before that initial indicative offer or letter of intent goes out, you have really limited options. A lot of it is looking for public information, checking out, Glassdoor reviews on the company. And most firms will have a Glassdoor, even if there's only 1 or 2 entries on it, if they're a particularly small company. Looking at the LinkedIn profiles, what people brag about, if they've done any kind of press releases, that sort of thing. And that can at least give you an early indicator of what's going on. And that's why after the deal is announced and you can start talking to the employees, it's really important to get in and talk with those employees and not just talk at them, but actually listen to what they have to say back, because that's where you get the real sense of the culture and the real sense of how things are going. It is consistently amazing to me how disconnected, when you get an organization that's really over about 100 people, the disconnect between the leaders and the folks actually doing the work tends to grow the bigger those organizations get. And so I can ask the leader questions till the cows come home and not get an accurate answer. But the minute we announce and I can get in and start talking to the employees, I get a better sense of what's going on with the company.